In 1867, a German-born watchmaker walked into the Universal Exhibition in Paris carrying a pocket watch made of cheap metal with a movement so stripped down it had barely 57 parts inside. 152 Swiss competitors were already there, showing off their finest work: gold cases, silver cases, jeweled movements with 200 components or more. The kind of watches that cost a factory worker half a year of wages just to hold in his hand. Roskopf's entry looked rough next to all of that. The mechanism inside was crude by the standards of the day. The case was made of German silver, which is not actually silver at all. It is just an alloy of copper, zinc, and nickel. And his price? 20 Swiss francs. About 1 week of pay for an unskilled laborer. The judges gave him a bronze medal. Nobody in that exhibition hall saw that coming, least of all Roskopf himself. And from that point forward, orders started pouring in from Paris, from Brussels, from Rio de Janeiro, from Cairo. But here is the part that makes this story worth telling. The country where Roskopf lived and worked, Switzerland itself, the watchmaking capital of the world, wanted nothing to do with him. They had already tried to stop him before the exhibition even happened. They would keep trying after it. And by the time the dust settled, the man behind one of the most successful watch designs in history would leave the industry a broken man, while everyone else got rich selling copies of his idea. So how did a butcher's son from a German village end up at the center of one of the bitterest feuds in watchmaking history? Georg Friedrich Roskopf was born on March 15, 1813, in a small village called Niederwiller. At the time, Niederwiller sat in the Grand Duchy of Baden, Germany. Today, that same village is part of the French province of Alsace, right on the border where France, Germany, and Switzerland meet. Georg was the fourth of 10 children. His father, Johann Georg, was a butcher and innkeeper. The family was not poor, but with 10 mouths to feed, there was no path forward for all of them in that village. The Black Forest region where Roskopf grew up already had a long tradition of clockmaking, so the idea of working with timepieces was not foreign to him. But the real watch industry, the one that made the precision pocket watches carried by gentlemen and professionals across Europe, was centered in Switzerland. In 1829, at the age of 16, Roskopf left home and traveled south to La Chaux-de-Fonds, a small city tucked into the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. La Chaux-de-Fonds was already the beating heart of Swiss watchmaking by the time he arrived. The streets were lined with workshops. The air smelled of brass filings and machine oil. Almost everybody in the city was connected to the watch trade in one way or another. But the way they made watches, there was nothing like what you would picture when you think of a modern factory. Swiss watchmaking in the 1830s ran on something called the cottage industry system. There were no large factories. Instead, individual craftsmen worked out of their own homes, each one specializing in a single component of the finished watch. One household made dials, another cut gears. Somebody down the block finished cases. A specialist across town produced escapements. Another family 2 streets over made nothing but balance springs, day after day, year after year. The level of specialization was extreme. A man might spend his entire career making one particular type of screw for one particular part of a watch movement. His father had done the same thing, and his sons would follow. The skills were passed down through generations, protected jealously, and priced accordingly. Then, a company called an établisseur would go around to all of these separate workshops, purchase the individual parts, and assemble them into a finished watch for sale. The system produced extremely high-quality timepieces. Each component was made by an expert who had devoted years to mastering that one piece. But the trade-off was that the whole process was slow, expensive, and completely dependent on each artisan's willingness to cooperate. Every watch was essentially a collaboration between dozens of independent craftsmen. And if those craftsmen decided they did not want to supply you, for any reason, you simply could not build a watch. Remember that detail, because it becomes the hinge of this entire story. Roskopf landed an apprenticeship at a firm called Meret and Sandoz, which sold hardware and watchmaker supplies. He spent 3 years there learning the business from the supply side, seeing firsthand how the different pieces of a watch came together and what each component cost. Then, in 1834, he switched over to actual watchmaking and apprenticed under a man named J. Biber. That apprenticeship lasted exactly 1 year before Roskopf quit. He married a woman named Françoise Lorimier. She was a widow, 17 years older than him. She had 2 children from her previous marriage. And she had money, real money, enough to stake a business. In 1835, using his wife's savings, Roskopf opened his own watch shop at 18 Leopold Robert Street in La Chaux-de-Fonds. For the next 15 years, Roskopf worked as an établisseur himself, buying parts from the local cottage workers and assembling finished watches for export to North America and Belgium. The watches he produced were well made. Quality was never his problem. The problem was the business side. Margins were thin, the market was competitive, and the watch trade was a hard place to turn a profit if you did not already have a reputation. By 1850, the company was losing money, and Roskopf sold it. He took a salaried job as manager of the Swiss branch of Gutmann Brothers, a German firm from Würzburg that assembled English-style watches for the American market. He stayed there about 4 years, learning how larger-scale operations worked and seeing the appetite for affordable watches in the American colonies. Then, in 1855, Roskopf tried the business route one more time, setting up a new company with his son Fritz Eduard and a partner named Henri Gindreau. They called it Roskopf, Gindreau and Company. That partnership fell apart within 2 years. Fritz Eduard, his own son, left to open his own watch business down in Geneva. Gindreau left to become the director of the watchmaking school in Neuchâtel. Both departures were voluntary. Neither man was fired or forced out. They simply saw better opportunities elsewhere and took them. And Roskopf found himself alone again, past the age of 40, twice failed in business, abandoned by his business partners, circling the same question that had been eating at him for 2 decades. Why did a decent pocket watch have to cost so much? Think about what that question meant in the 1850s. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping every city in Europe. Factories ran on schedules. Railroads ran on schedules. The entire economy was being reorganized around precision timekeeping. And the people who actually worked in those factories and rode those trains could not afford a watch. A basic Swiss pocket watch cost anywhere from 50 to over 100 francs. The finer pieces with gold or silver cases went for several hundred. A skilled workshop laborer earned maybe 3 or 4 francs a day. An unskilled worker earned even less. So a watch represented weeks or even months of savings, an amount that most families needed for food and rent. For a factory hand or a farm worker, buying a pocket watch was as realistic as buying a horse. You told the time by church bells. You listened for the factory whistle. You asked somebody who owned a watch and you hoped they were nearby. Or you looked at the sun and made your best guess. The entire modern world was being built on the idea of keeping time, and the people doing the building could not afford to know what time it was. Roskopf decided that did not have to be the case. Starting around 1860, he began designing a pocket watch that could sell for 20 Swiss francs. That number was specific and deliberate. 20 francs was roughly 1 week of wages for an unskilled laborer. Expensive, yes, but within reach. An object that a bricklayer in Lyon, a textile worker in Brussels, or a dock worker in Hamburg could actually save up for and buy. He called it the Montre Proletaire, the proletarian watch. And to hit that price, Roskopf had to redesign the pocket watch from the ground up. The standard Swiss pocket watch of that era contained somewhere around 160 individual parts. Roskopf cut that number to 57. He chose a pin pallet escapement, a type of mechanism originally designed by a French watchmaker named L. Perron back in 1798. Where the standard escapement used jewels, which were expensive, Roskopf used simple steel pins. He removed the center wheel entirely, which was a radical departure from accepted practice, so that the third wheel was driven directly from the mainspring barrel. For the first version of the watch, he even skipped the hand-setting mechanism entirely. You opened the hinged bezel and pushed the hands with your fingertip, like setting a clock on a mantle. For the case, he chose German silver instead of real silver or gold. The watch was plain. It was not pretty on the inside. A traditional Swiss watchmaker would have looked at that movement and winced, but it worked. It kept reasonable time, and it could be manufactured at a cost that made 20 francs viable. A traditional pocket watch required the work of a dozen specialized artisans, each one contributing a finely crafted component that had to be individually fitted and adjusted. Roskopf's mechanism could be assembled from standardized parts by workers who did not need years of training in Geneva or Le Loc. The trade-off was precision. A Roskopf watch was never going to satisfy a railroad engineer or a ship's navigator, but it could tell a factory worker when his shift started and when the last train home was leaving. For the millions of people across Europe who had never owned any kind of personal timepiece, that was more than enough. Roskopf did not work in isolation during those years. He consulted with Jules Grossman, the director of the Les Local Watchmaking School, and studied earlier winding systems, eventually choosing a keyless winding mechanism based on the system Jean-Adrien Philippe had invented in 1842. Philippe's design was so successful that Count von Patek had made him a partner at what became Patek Philippe. Roskopf was borrowing from the best while stripping away everything else. The design took more than 5 years to finalize. By 1866, Roskopf had a working prototype and he needed parts for a production run. This is where the story turns ugly. Roskopf placed an order for 2 boxes of ebauches, the raw, unfinished watch movements, from a supplier named Émile Roulet. He also contacted Gustave Rosselet to produce escapements. Both men refused. Flat out. The watchmakers of La Chaux-de-Fonds had heard what Roskopf was building, and they closed ranks against him. These were artisans who had spent their entire lives mastering intricate, expensive mechanisms. Their identities, their livelihoods, their reputations were built on the principle that a watch was a work of art. And here was Roskopf, asking them to help him mass-produce a crude mechanism in a cheap case for a fraction of the normal price. They called him a destroyer of their craft. That was the phrase used at the time. The journal Suisse d'Horlogerie would later describe what Roskopf faced as indifference, mocking remarks, and even hostility from his family and the watchmaking world alike. Swiss competitors accused him of cheapening an entire industry. And because the cottage system meant that independent artisans controlled every stage of production, their refusal to cooperate was an effective blockade. Roskopf found another way. The Malloret Watch Company, located outside the main watchmaking centers, agreed to supply ebauches and cases. He gathered additional parts from smaller, less established suppliers. Workers from the French Jura and from the canton of Bern filled positions that the La Chaux-de-Fonds artisans refused to take. And because he could not get the watches assembled in Switzerland, Roskopf shipped the parts to Damprechard in France, where a man named M. Chatelain assembled them. The first order was 2,000 watches. By the end of 1867, production was underway. Roskopf got into the Paris Universal Exhibition through the influence of the House of Breguet, one of the most famous names in French and European watchmaking. Whether Breguet helped him out of genuine admiration for the concept or out of sheer curiosity about what would happen when a 20-franc watch showed up at the biggest exhibition in Europe, nobody recorded, but Roskopf got his spot. The scene at that exhibition is worth pausing on. The Universal Exhibition of 1867 was enormous. It drew exhibitors and visitors from all over the world, and the watch section was one of the most competitive arenas in the entire fair. 152 Swiss watchmakers had each sent their finest timepieces. These were watches in polished gold and silver cases, with jeweled, hand-finished movements that represented decades of accumulated skill and generations of tradition. Each exhibitor was vying for recognition, for medals, for the prestige that came with being judged the best in the world at what they did. And then there was Roskopf's contribution, a stripped-down mechanism in a base metal case. No jewels, no precious metals. A watch that cost less than a good pair of boots. When the international jury awarded Roskopf a bronze medal, out of a total pool of 4 gold, 6 silver, and 15 bronze, the Swiss watchmaking establishment could barely contain its disbelief. The judges had looked at the cheapest, simplest watch in the room and said, yes, this has value. It was not a gold medal. It was not even silver. But it was official recognition from an international body that the proletarian watch mattered. And for the artisans who had tried to stop Roskopf from building it, that bronze medal landed like a slap. After Paris, the orders came fast. Breguet placed direct orders for 100 to 200 pieces at a time. Other firms followed. In 1869, the watch won a silver medal at the Amsterdam exhibition. By 1870, Roskopf was ordering 20,000 ebauches per batch. France, Belgium, Brazil, Egypt, and the Indies all bought in. The proletarian watch sold everywhere. Everywhere except Switzerland. In 1870, Roskopf released an improved second version priced at 25 francs. This one had a proper hand-setting mechanism, a simplified escapement fitting, and an upgraded winding system. He licensed Adrien Philippe's free mainspring barrel patent, paying a royalty on every watch. That patent virtually eliminated mainspring breakage, making the proletarian watch even more reliable for the working people it was meant to serve. And this is where everything fell apart. Roskopf never patented his design in Switzerland because he could not. There was no Swiss patent office until 1888. He filed patents in Belgium in 1867, in the United States in 1868, and in France that same year. But in his home country, his design was legally unprotected. From 1867 through at least 1888, any Swiss watchmaker could copy his mechanism, produce their own version, and sell it without paying Roskopf anything. And that is precisely what happened. Companies across Switzerland began manufacturing what they called Roskopf-type watches. Since they could not use his exact trademark, they would label their watches with names that sounded close enough. Some spelled it slightly differently. Others used the term Roskopf-type as a category description rather than a brand name. Some of these copies were passable, many were awful. Shoddy knockoffs with poor materials and unreliable movements flooded the market, and every one of them traded on the association with Roskopf's name and his original idea. Think about what that did to him. The same watchmakers who had called him a destroyer of their craft, the same suppliers who had refused to fill his parts orders, were now copying his mechanism for profit and undercutting him in the process. And the bad copies were doing something even worse. They were destroying his reputation. A customer in France or Belgium who bought a cheaply made imitation and watched it stop running after a few weeks did not know the difference between a genuine Roskopf watch and a lazy knockoff. They just knew the affordable watch they had been excited about turned out to be unreliable, and they told everyone. The name Roskopf started to become associated with poor quality, with junk, with something that did not work. And there was no legal mechanism in Switzerland for Roskopf to fight any of it. The patent office did not exist yet. His trademark gave him some protection on the brand name itself, but it could not stop other manufacturers from copying the mechanism inside. While all of this was happening, Roskopf lost his wife. Françoise Lorimier died in 1872. She was the person who had believed in him when nobody else did. Her money had built the business. Her confidence had sustained him through years of failure and rejection. Without her, Roskopf faced a question about the future of the company, and his answer reveals something about his character. The capital that funded his business had come from Françoise. The Ville brothers, Charles and Eugene, were her grandsons from her first marriage, making them Roskopf's step-grandsons. In 1873, Roskopf transferred the entire business to the Willet brothers and their associate Charles Leon Schmid. The company became Willet Frères. Roskopf gave them the name, the trademarks, the designs, everything. He felt he owed that debt to his late wife's family. Then he walked away from watchmaking entirely. After more than 30 years in the trade, after decades of building, failing, rebuilding, and fighting an industry that wanted to pretend he did not exist, Roskopf left. He remarried that same year, a school teacher from the town of Cernier, 24 years younger than him. They lived briefly in Cernier, where Roskopf finally acquired Swiss citizenship in 1874. He had been living in Switzerland since 1829. That is 45 years in the country before they granted him citizenship. After Cernia, they moved to Bern, as far from La Chaux-de-Fonds and the watch benches and the cottage workshops as Roskopf could get while still staying within Swiss borders. He did not go back. During the 5 years that Roskopf himself oversaw production, fewer than 100,000 watches were made. That number, while respectable for a man building against the entire weight of his own industry, barely foreshadows what followed. Georg Friedrich Roskopf died on April 14, 1889, in his apartment in Bern. He was 76 years old. He had been out of the watch business for over 15 years by then. According to Liliane Roskopf, his great-great-great-granddaughter, who still lives in Geneva, he was an embittered, wounded man who had fled La Chaux-de-Fonds and the watchmaking world entirely. A man who spent his final years far from the industry he had tried to transform, convinced that the fight had not been worth it. He never saw what his invention became. After his death, multiple firms claimed to be the true Roskopf successor. Willy Frères held the trademark and enforced it. They built 2 large factories in La Chaux-de-Fonds, the same city that had refused to sell Roskopf parts, and launched industrial-scale production. Over the decades, the movements were miniaturized to fit wristwatches. The total production of genuine Roskopf patent watches reached an estimated 20 million units. Even Roskopf's grandson circled back to the business eventually. Louis Friedrich Roskopf was not a watchmaker at all. He was a tropical bird dealer. But around 1900, when he noticed that every watch company in La Chaux-de-Fonds seemed to be making money from Roskopf-type watches, he came home and co-founded Louis Roskopf and Company with a watchmaker named Léon-Henri Reinbold. That company merged with the Reconvilier Watch Company in the early 1920s. In 1939, the Association of Roskopf Watch Manufacturers was formally established in Biel, Switzerland. Think about that for a moment. The same country that had refused to sell him parts, mocked his ambition, and left his design unprotected, now had an entire trade association bearing his name, dedicated to coordinating the production and marketing of the type of watch he invented. By the middle of the 20th century, the Roskopf-type watch was the single most exported Swiss timepiece in the world. Millions shipped every year to Britain, to the United States, and to dozens of developing nations. Individual factories in the Roskopf segment were producing over 1 million units per year by the early 1960s. One company alone, Aegon Watch in the town of Mumpf, employed 160 workers and shipped watches to nearly 60 countries. In the United States, affordable watches were being sold outside traditional jewelry stores, in general shops, and through mail-order catalogs, and the Roskopf mechanism was at the heart of that market. People compared his design to the Swatch before Swatch existed, a timepiece that was never meant to be the best, just good enough for the person who needed to know the time, good enough to catch a train, even if it was never precise enough to run one. The Roskopf brand finally vanished during the Quartz crisis of the 1970s and 80s. Beginning in the late 1960s, cheap electronic watches from Japan, and particularly the rise of Timex and Seiko in the affordable segment, wiped out the market for low-cost mechanical timepieces. Timex alone was selling over 12 million watches per year by the mid-60s. The Roskopf Company and the entire ecosystem of Swiss Roskopf-type manufacturers could not compete with battery-powered quartz movements that were cheaper to produce and more accurate to keep. The brand that had once disrupted an industry by being the cheapest option was now being disrupted in exactly the same way. 100 years after Roskopf's idea, a new generation of engineers in Tokyo had done to Swiss mechanical watchmaking what Roskopf had tried to do to Swiss artisan watchmaking. The cycle repeated, and the Roskopf name disappeared from the market. There is one detail in this whole story that deserves to be pulled out and examined on its own. When Roskopf went looking for parts suppliers in 1866, the established watchmakers of La Chaux-de-Fonds did not just decline his orders. They refused because they believed cheap watches were beneath them. They saw making a watch affordable as an act of degradation. They thought that giving ordinary workers access to personal timekeeping would cheapen the entire art of watchmaking. And in a narrow, craft-centered way, maybe they had a point. The Roskopf watch was never beautiful. The movements were coarse. The cases were plain. But those artisans missed what Roskopf understood from the start. A bricklayer in Lyon did not care about jeweled escapements. A textile worker in Brussels was not interested in hand-polished balance wheels. A dock worker in Marseille was never going to hold a watch up to the light and admire the finishing on the movement. These were people who needed to know when their shift started, when lunch was over, and when the last train left for home. The proletarian watch was designed for them, and the next century proved what Roskopf had guessed all along. Those people, the ones the Swiss watchmaking elite did not think were worth building a watch for, made up the overwhelming majority of the world. They were the market. They had always been the market. The artisans just could not see it because they were too busy looking at their own reflections in polished gold. 20 million watches with his name stamped on them. Factories in the city that locked him out. A trade association founded 50 years after his death. And a man who died in a quiet apartment in Bern, believing that the world had moved on without him. It had. Just not in the direction he expected. If this story stuck with you, hit subscribe and leave a comment with the invention you think was most underappreciated in its own time. Drop a like on the way out so this video reaches more people who have never heard the name Roskopf.